On a gray morning in November of 1996, a brand new Caterpillar 330 excavator went over the edge of Miller's Creek, and three men stood at the top of the ravine trying to figure out how to get it back. The excavator had been working on a drainage project for the county, widening the creek channel, reinforcing the banks, the kind of work that heavy equipment was made for. But the operator had gotten too close to the edge, and 3 days of rain had weakened the soil more than anyone realized. The bank had given way at 7:43 in the morning. The operator, a young man named Kevin Walsh, had felt the ground shift beneath the tracks and had exactly 2 seconds to decide, stay with the machine or jump. He jumped. The excavator had gone over without him, tumbling 40 feet down a near vertical slope, bouncing twice off the rocky walls of the ravine before coming to rest at the bottom, tilted at a 45-degree angle, half buried in the creek mud. Kevin had walked away with a sprained ankle and a story he'd be telling for the rest of his life. The excavator wasn't so lucky. Let me tell you about that machine, because understanding what was stuck down there helps you understand why getting it out seemed impossible. The Caterpillar 330 was one of the biggest excavators in common use in 19. It weighed 72,000 pounds, 36 tons of steel, hydraulics and diesel engine. Brand new, it cost about $200,000. The one at the bottom of Miller's Creek was 6 months old and had barely broken in. The construction company that owned it, Morrison & Sons out of Council Bluffs, couldn't afford to lose it. Insurance would cover some of the cost, but not all, and the deductible alone would hurt. More importantly, they needed that excavator for 3 other jobs that were already scheduled. Renting a replacement would cost thousands of dollars a week. So they called in the professionals. Let me tell you about Heavy Lift Recovery, because they're important to this story. Heavy Lift Recovery was based out of Omaha and had been in business for 15 years. They specialized in exactly this kind of work, extracting heavy equipment from places it wasn't supposed to be. Overturned semi-trucks, cranes that had tipped over, construction equipment stuck in mud or fallen into ditches. They had the best equipment money could buy. 2 heavy-duty recovery trucks, each one equipped with hydraulic winches rated for 50 tons, synthetic recovery cables that were supposed to be stronger than steel at half the weight. A crew of 4 men who had, collectively, recovered over 1,000 pieces of stuck equipment. The crew chief was a man named Derek Hollis. Let me tell you about Derek Hollis, because you need to understand him before you can appreciate what happened. Derek was 38 years old and had been in the recovery business since he was 19. He'd started as a grunt, worked his way up to operator, and eventually started his own company. Heavy Lift Recovery was his baby. Built from nothing, grown into the most respected recovery operation in the tri-state area. Derek was good at his job, very good. He had a talent for looking at a stuck piece of equipment and seeing exactly how to get it out. He understood angles and forces and the physics of heavy loads. He'd pulled equipment out of situations that other companies had declared impossible. But Derek had a problem that came with his success. He'd stopped listening to anyone else. 15 years of being the expert, 15 years of being right when everyone else was wrong, had given Derek an unshakable confidence in his own judgment. He knew everything worth knowing about equipment recovery. If he said something could be done, it could be done. If he said it couldn't be done, it couldn't be done. It couldn't be done. End of discussion. When Derek arrived at Miller's Creek on that November morning, he took one look at the stuck excavator and announced to everyone within earshot that he'd have it out by lunch. "I've pulled bigger machines out of worse spots," he said. "This is a 3-hour job, maximum." That had been at 8 in the morning. It was now 2 in the afternoon, and the excavator hadn't moved an inch. Let me tell you about the first 6 hours, because they explain why Derek Hollis eventually threw his hard hat on the ground and gave up. The problem wasn't the weight of the excavator. Derek's equipment could handle 72,000 pounds. That was well within the rated capacity of his winches and cables. The problem was the angle. The ravine wall wasn't just steep. It was nearly vertical in places, with a slope that averaged about 70 degrees. The excavator sat at the bottom, 40 feet down, wedged between two rock outcroppings and buried in mud that had the consistency of wet concrete. To pull the excavator out, you couldn't just winch it straight up. The cable would have to bend over the lip of the ravine, and that bend created friction. The friction created heat. The heat weakened the cable. Derek's first attempt had seemed straightforward. He'd anchored both trucks to trees 50 feet back from the edge, run 2 cables down to the excavator, and engaged the winches. The cables had stretched. The winches had whined. The excavator had shifted slightly in the mud, and then the first cable had snapped. The sound was like a rifle shot. The broken cable whipped back toward the trucks with enough force to take a man's head off. Fortunately, Derek had kept everyone clear. "All right," Derek had said, examining the break. "We need a different angle. Let's set up the redirect pulleys." The redirect pulleys were supposed to solve the friction problem. By running the cable through a pulley at the lip of the ravine, you could change the direction of the pull without putting stress on the cable. It was good theory. In practice, the pulley's mounting point couldn't handle the load. On the second attempt, the pulley anchor ripped out of the ground and the cable snapped again. The third attempt involved chaining the recovery trucks together to double the pulling power. That had seemed promising. The excavator had actually risen about 2 feet out of the mud before the third cable broke. The fourth attempt was the one that nearly ended in disaster. Derek had decided to anchor one truck to a massive oak tree closer to the edge. The truck had started to slide, pulling the anchor tree's roots out of the rain-soaked ground. Only quick thinking by Derek's crew, jamming the truck into reverse and cutting the cable, had prevented a second piece of equipment from going over the edge. Now Derek stood at the edge of the ravine with 4 broken cables piled at his feet, his trucks damaged, his crew exhausted, and the excavator sitting exactly where it had been 6 hours ago. "Well?" Morrison, the excavator's owner, asked. "What's the plan?" Derek threw his hard hat on the ground. "There is no plan. That machine is impossible to recover with conventional equipment. The angle's too steep, the mud's too deep, and the lip of that ravine destroys every cable we put over it. We could try a helicopter, but the cost would be more than the machine is worth. Or you could wait until spring, let the ground dry out, and try again with heavier equipment." "Spring? I need that excavator now." "Then you're going to have to find someone else, because I'm telling you, with the equipment available today, that excavator belongs to the creek." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but he'd watched every attempt fail. He'd seen the cables snap, the anchors pull loose, the recovery trucks slide toward the edge. He knew Derek Hollis was the best in the business. If Derek said it couldn't be done, it couldn't be done. That's when the old Ford pickup pulled up to the edge of the site. Now let me tell you about Eugene Pratt, because you need to understand him to understand what happened next. Eugene was 71 years old and had farmed 280 acres on the other side of Miller's Creek for 48 years. His land bordered the drainage project, and he'd been watching the construction crews work for the past 2 weeks, watching and shaking his head at some of the things he saw. The morning the excavator went over, Eugene had been on his back porch having coffee. He'd heard the sound, a distant rumbling, then silence, and he'd known immediately what had happened. Ground's too wet, he'd thought. Told them it was too wet. He hadn't told them anything, of course. Nobody asked farmers for advice anymore. The construction crews had their engineers and their soil samples and their computer models. They didn't need an old man's opinion about mud, but Eugene had walked over that afternoon anyway, curious to see how bad it was. He'd stood at the edge of the ravine, looked down at the stuck excavator, and immediately started thinking about how to get it out. Eugene Pratt had been pulling things out of Iowa mud for 50 years. Tractors, trucks, combines, wagons. If it had wheels or tracks and got stuck, Eugene had probably pulled it out at some point. His grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him, using techniques that went back to the days before engines, when everything had to be moved with horses and human ingenuity. The key was mechanical advantage. Eugene had watched the recovery crew work all morning. He'd watched them try to overpower the problem with brute force, bigger winches, stronger cables, more trucks. He'd watched them fail, again and again, because they didn't understand the fundamental truth that his grandfather had taught him 60 years ago. You can't beat physics with muscle. You have to work with physics, not against it. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched an expert struggle with something you knew how to do? Have you ever stood back and kept your mouth shut because you knew they wouldn't listen? Because expertise and pride make people deaf to suggestions from people they consider beneath them. Eugene Pratt had watched the recovery crew fail all morning, knowing exactly what they were doing wrong, knowing exactly how to fix it. But he'd kept his mouth shut because he knew Derek Hollis wouldn't listen to a 71-year-old farmer. Then Derek had thrown his hard hat on the ground and declared the excavator unrecoverable, and Eugene had gotten in his truck and driven over. Let me tell you about what was in the back of Eugene's pickup, because it looked like junk, and it was anything but. Eugene had inherited his equipment from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. Some of it dated back to the 1920s. All of it was made of iron and steel, built in an era when things were designed to last forever. There were chains, not modern alloy chains, but old-fashioned iron chains, with links as thick as a man's thumb. The chains were rusty, heavy, and ugly. They were also capable of holding loads that would snap modern equipment like thread. There were pulleys, cast iron snatch blocks with steel sheaves, some of them stamped with dates from the 19th. The pulleys were designed to be used with natural fiber rope, but they worked just as well with chain. Each pulley could redirect a load with minimal friction, and when combined in series, they created what was called a block and tackle, a system that multiplied force. And there was the PTO winch, a mechanical drum that connected to a tractor's power takeoff shaft, driven by the engine itself rather than by hydraulics. The winch was slow, brutally slow, but it never stopped pulling. It didn't have sensors to tell it when to quit. It didn't have safety cutoffs. It just kept turning, kept pulling, kept applying force, until something moved or something broke. Derek Hollis watched Eugene unload this equipment with a look of disbelief that slowly turned to amusement. "Old-timer," Derek said, "what exactly do you think you're doing? Thought I might be able to help." "Help?" Derek laughed, a short, sharp sound. "We just spent 6 hours trying to pull that excavator out with equipment rated for 50 tons. We broke 4 cables. We nearly lost a truck. And you think He pointed at Eugene's rusty chains and ancient pulleys. "You think that junk is going to do what our equipment couldn't? It might. It won't. That excavator weighs 36 tons. Your chains might hold, I'll give you that. But you don't have anything to pull with. That old tractor of yours, what is it, a Ford, makes maybe 40 horsepower. My trucks make 5 times that. Your trucks kept breaking cables because of the angle. The friction at the lip of that ravine." "I know," Eugene interrupted quietly. "I watched. You're trying to pull against that edge. You need to pull with it." Derek crossed his arms. "What does that even mean?" Eugene didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the edge of the ravine and looked down at the stuck excavator. He studied the angle of the slope, the position of the machine, the rock outcroppings that had stopped its fall. He looked at the lip of the ravine, the sharp edge that had destroyed Derek's cables. Then he started doing something that made Derek Hollis shake his head in disbelief. He walked down into the ravine. Let me tell you about what Eugene saw when he got to the bottom, because that's when he knew exactly how to solve the problem. The excavator sat in a natural cradle formed by 2 rock outcroppings. Its front end, the boom and bucket, pointed uphill, while its back end was buried in mud. The tracks were completely submerged. Derek's approach had been straightforward. Attach cables to the excavator's frame and pull it straight up the slope. Simple, direct, wrong. The problem was that straight up meant pulling over the lip of the ravine, and that lip was essentially a knife edge of rock. Every cable that went over it was being sawed through by its own tension. The more weight on the cable, the faster it cut through. Eugene looked at the ravine walls. They weren't uniformly steep. About 30 feet to the left of where the excavator sat, the wall had partially collapsed in some past erosion event. The slope there was maybe 40 degrees instead of 70, still steep but manageable. More importantly, there was no knife edge at the top. The collapsed section had created a ramp of sorts, rough and rocky but continuous. Derek had ignored this route because it was longer, maybe 100 feet of total pull instead of 40. His instinct had been to take the direct path. Eugene's instinct was different. You always pull the long way if the short way is impossible, his grandfather had told him. 100 feet of possible beats 40 feet of impossible, every time. Eugene climbed back up the ravine and walked over to Derek Hollis. "I'll make you a deal," Eugene said. "Let me try my way. If it doesn't work, you haven't lost anything. If it does work, you learn something." Derek laughed. "And what could an old farmer teach me about equipment recovery? Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Do we have a deal?" Derek looked at the excavator, then at his broken cables, then at his crew who had been watching this exchange with tired amusement. "Fine. Do whatever you want, old-timer. When your chains break like our cables did, we'll all have a good laugh and go home." Let me tell you about Eugene's setup, because it was a master class in applied physics. Eugene didn't try to pull the excavator straight up the steep slope. Instead, he planned a different route entirely, a zigzag path that used the collapsed section of the ravine wall. The first leg would pull the excavator sideways out of the mud and onto the rock shelf where it currently sat. The second leg would angle it toward the collapsed section. The third leg would pull it up the gentler slope. The fourth leg would bring it over the top onto flat ground. Each leg was shorter than Derek's straight-line pull. Each leg involved an easier angle. And by using multiple direction changes, Eugene could eliminate the killer problem that had destroyed Derek's cables, the knife-edge lip. But the direction changes required something Derek's setup couldn't do. They required pulling in multiple directions without repositioning the anchor point each time. That's where the block and tackle system came in. Eugene set his anchor point, a massive oak tree, 100 feet back from the collapsed section of the ravine. Then he ran his chain from the tree, through a snatch block at the lip of the collapsed section, down to the excavator, back up to a second snatch block, and finally to his tractor. The geometry was complex, but the principle was simple. Each pulley in the system multiplied force. Eugene's rig used 4 pulleys in a gun tackle configuration, which meant that every pound of pulling force from his tractor became 4 pounds of force on the excavator. His tractor made 40 horsepower at the drawbar. With the pulleys, that became effectively 160 horsepower, not as much as Derek's trucks, but applied differently. Applied slowly, applied continuously, applied without the sudden shocks that had snapped cable after cable. "You're going to pull sideways first?" Derek asked, watching Eugene work. "Got to get it out of that mud before I can move it uphill. That'll take forever, faster than never." Eugene finished his setup and walked to his tractor, an old Ford 5000, faded blue, 30 years old, and still running like the day it was made. He started the engine, engaged the PTO, and began taking up slack in the chain. The block and tackle system creaked. The chains went taut, the pulleys groaned, and the excavator for the first time in 6 hours moved. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours, because they were the slowest and most satisfying 3 hours Eugene Pratt had experienced in years. The excavator moved slowly, incredibly slowly. Eugene's rig pulled at maybe 1 foot per minute, 60 feet per hour. At that rate, the full extraction would take nearly 2 hours just for the pulling time, plus setup changes between each leg. But it moved. The first leg, pulling the excavator sideways out of the mud, took 45 minutes. The machine groaned and complained, its 36 tons resisting every inch. But the chains held, the pulleys turned, the tractor kept pulling. When the excavator finally cleared the mud and sat on solid rock, Derek Hollis stopped laughing. The second leg was trickier. Eugene had to partially disassemble his rig, reposition 2 pulleys, and establish a new pull angle. It took 30 minutes just to set up. But when he started pulling again, the excavator obediently followed the chains, inching its way toward the collapsed section of the ravine wall. Derek's crew gathered to watch. They'd never seen anything like this. A 71-year-old farmer with 30-year-old equipment moving a 36-ton excavator through a route that their sophisticated gear couldn't manage. "How does he know it won't break?" one of the crew asked. "He doesn't," another answered. "But watch his setup. He's not fighting the load, he's directing it. When he changes angles, the chain goes slack for a second. No shock loading, no sudden stress. That's what broke our cables. Yeah, we were yanking. He's persuading. Now let me tell you about the third leg, because that's when Derek Hollis finally understood what he was watching. The third leg was the main event, pulling the excavator up the collapsed section of the ravine wall. The slope was still steep, maybe 40 degrees, but it was continuous. No knife edges, no sudden drops, just a rough, rocky ramp that the excavator's tracks could grip. Eugene repositioned his rig one more time, adding a fifth pulley to increase his mechanical advantage. Now every pound from the tractor became 5 pounds on the excavator. He started the pull. The chains sang with tension. The tractor's engine labored. The excavator began to climb. Foot by foot, inch by inch, the massive machine crawled up the slope like some prehistoric creature emerging from the earth. Its tracks found purchase on the rocks. Its weight shifted from impossible to manageable to almost easy as the angle decreased with every foot of progress. Derek Hollis walked over to Eugene's tractor and stood watching. "How?" he asked finally. Eugene didn't take his eyes off the chains. "How what?" "How did you know this would work? We tried everything." "You tried one thing," Eugene said. "You tried the direct path. When that didn't work, you tried it harder. When that didn't work, you tried it with more equipment. What should we have done? What I'm doing. When the direct path doesn't work, you find an indirect path. When force doesn't work, you use leverage. When speed doesn't work, you use patience." The excavator was halfway up now. The worst was behind it. "Those chains," Derek said. "Those pulleys. Where did you get them?" "My grandfather. He got them from his father. They've been pulling things out of Iowa mud since before my father was born. They must be 60, 70 years old. The chains are. The pulleys are older. Some of them were made before World War I." Derek shook his head. "And they're stronger than our 50-ton cables?" "They're not stronger. They're used different." Eugene finally looked at Derek. "Your cables are designed for speed. Hook up, pull hard, get the job done. When everything goes right, they're great. But when something goes wrong, when there's friction, or shock loading, or an angle you didn't expect, they fail. And your chains, my chains are designed for stubborn. They don't care how long the job takes. They don't have a schedule. They just keep pulling until the job is done or the world ends." The excavator crested the slope. Its front tracks came over the lip of the collapsed section and bit into flat ground. A few more minutes of pulling, and the whole machine sat on level earth, muddy, battered, but intact. Eugene shut down the tractor and let out a breath he'd been holding for 3 hours. The excavator was out. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with a recovered excavator. Morrison, the excavator's owner, was so happy he tried to pay Eugene on the spot. Cash, whatever Eugene wanted. Name his price. Eugene refused. "I didn't do it for money," he said. "I did it because it was sitting there stuck and somebody had to get it out. There has to be something I can give you." Eugene thought about it. "You could do me one favor. Anything. Next time you're working near my land, ask me about the ground conditions before you start. I've been walking that creek for 50 years. I know where the mud is soft and where it's solid. I know where the banks are stable and where they're not. Your engineers have their soil samples and their computer models, but I have something they don't." "What's that?" "I've been paying attention." Morrison nodded slowly. "You've got a deal. Let me tell you about Derek Hollis, because what happened next tells you the kind of man he was beneath the arrogance. Derek could have packed up his equipment and driven away. He could have pretended the last 3 hours hadn't happened, gone back to Omaha, and never spoken of it again. That's what most people would have done. That's what pride would have demanded. But Derek wasn't most people. He walked over to Eugene's truck, where the old farmer was coiling his chains and checking his pulleys for damage. "Mr. Pratt," Derek said. Eugene looked up. "Yes, I owe you an apology. I laughed at you, called your equipment junk, told you it wouldn't work. You did. I was wrong." Eugene nodded. "Apology accepted. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Where did you learn to do that?" "The multiple legs, the angle changes, the way you set up those pulleys. I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Eugene was quiet for a moment, looking at his equipment, the rusty chains, the ancient pulleys, the cast-iron snatch blocks that had outlasted everything else. "My grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me. They called it slow rigging. Before engines, before hydraulics, when everything had to be moved with horses and human strength, this was how people moved heavy loads. You couldn't overpower anything. You had to outsmart it. Slow rigging. Most people have forgotten. They think modern equipment can solve any problem. And most of the time they're right. Modern equipment is amazing. But sometimes you run into a problem that modern equipment can't solve, and then you need to remember the old ways. Derek looked at the chains in Eugene's hands. "Could you teach me?" Eugene raised an eyebrow. "You want me to teach you? I've been doing this job for 20 years. And today an old farmer showed me I don't know as much as I thought I did. That either means I'm stupid and should quit, or it means there's still things to learn and I should keep going. I'd rather keep going." Eugene smiled. It was the first real smile Derek had seen from him. "Come by my farm sometime. I'll show you what my grandfather taught me." "I'll do that." They shook hands. The city professional and the old farmer, the modern equipment and the ancient chains, the present and the past, finding a way to work together. Let me tell you about what happened over the following years, because Eugene Pratt and Derek Hollis became an unlikely team. Derek did come by the farm. He came on a Sunday afternoon in December, 3 weeks after the Millers Creek rescue. He brought his wife and a bottle of good whiskey, and he spent 4 hours in Eugene's barn, learning about slow rigging and mechanical advantage, and the patient application of physics. He came back a month later, and a month after that, and a month after that. Over the next 5 years, Eugene taught Derek everything his grandfather had taught him. The different types of tackle and when to use each one. How to read a load and understand where the stress would concentrate. How to set up a multi-leg pull that used gravity and terrain instead of fighting them. Derek incorporated these techniques into his business. He started carrying block and tackle equipment on his trucks, not as primary gear, but as backup for the jobs where modern methods failed. He trained his crews in slow rigging, made them understand that sometimes the old ways were the only ways. Heavy Lift Recovery's reputation grew. They became known as the company that never gave up, the company that would try approaches other companies had never considered. When other recovery operations declared a job impossible, Heavy Lift would show up with their chains and pulleys and prove them wrong. Derek never forgot where he'd learned those techniques. On every job where slow rigging saved the day, he told the story of Millers Creek, told it to his crews, his clients, anyone who would listen. The story of the old farmer who pulled out what the professionals couldn't. Let me tell you about Eugene Pratt's last years, because they were good ones. Eugene kept farming until 1999, when his knees finally gave out, and his doctor told him to stop climbing on tractors. He sold his equipment, most of it, to a young farmer just starting out, the same way his father had sold to him 50 years before. But he kept the chains. He kept the pulleys. He kept the cast-iron snatch blocks that his grandfather had bought before the First World War. "These stay in the family," he told his son Warren. "They've been pulling things out of Iowa mud for 100 years. That shouldn't stop because I'm too old to use them." Warren Pratt had moved to Des Moines in the 1980s, traded farming for insurance adjusting. But he came home when his father's health started failing, learned to use the old equipment, kept the tradition alive. Eugene Pratt died in October of 2003, at the age of 78. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Council Bluffs, and Derek Hollis drove down from Omaha with his entire crew. At the reception afterward, Derek told the Millers Creek story one more time. He told it better than he'd ever told it before. Told it with the love and respect of a student for a teacher who had changed his life. "That old farmer taught me the most important lesson of my career," Derek said. "He taught me that expertise isn't the same as knowledge, that modern doesn't mean better, that sometimes the old ways are the only ways, and the people who remember them are worth more than all the equipment in the world." Let me tell you about one last thing, because it happened in 2015, and it shows that some lessons never die. Derek Hollis, retired in 2010, sold heavy lift recovery to a younger man named Marcus who had worked for him for 15 years. Marcus had heard the Millers Creek story 100 times. He'd been trained in slow rigging. He carried block and tackle equipment on every truck. In 2015, Marcus got a call about a piece of equipment stuck in a ravine. A Caterpillar excavator, similar to the one from Millers Creek. The client had already tried 2 other recovery companies. Both had given up. Marcus drove out to look at the site. The excavator sat at the bottom of a steep ravine, wedged between rock outcroppings, half buried in mud. He started to laugh. "What's funny?" his crew chief asked. "This is Millers Creek. Different county, but the same job. Same stuck excavator. Same impossible angle. Can we get it out?" Marcus looked at the ravine. He looked at the excavator. He thought about Eugene Pratt, a man he'd never met, a man who had been dead for 12 years, a man whose techniques were still taught to every crew member at Heavy Lift Recovery. "Yeah," Marcus said, "we can get it out, but not the way you're thinking." He walked to the truck and pulled out the block and tackle equipment. The chains were newer than Eugene's. Marcus had replaced the worn links over the years, but the pulleys were the same ones Eugene had used, the same ones Eugene's grandfather had used. They were 100 years old now. They still worked perfectly. 3 hours later, the excavator was out. Same technique Eugene had used. Same patient application of physics. Same triumph of old knowledge over modern failure. Marcus took a picture of the recovered excavator and sent it to Derek Hollis, who was retired and living in Arizona. Derek sent back 2 words. Eugene would be proud. The chains and pulleys are still in use today. They've been pulling things out of Iowa mud for over 100 years now. First with Eugene's grandfather, then his father, then Eugene himself, then Derek Hollis, then Marcus, and now a whole new generation of recovery specialists who have been taught the old ways. The techniques have a name now. Derek and Marcus wrote them down, created training materials, taught courses at recovery industry conventions. They call it heritage rigging, a nod to the old-timers who developed these methods when there was no other choice. Sometimes a student asks why they still use 100-year-old equipment when modern gear is so much more advanced. Marcus always gives the same answer. The same answer Eugene Pratt gave Derek Hollis at the edge of Millers Creek in 19. Modern equipment is designed for speed. This equipment is designed for stubborn, and when speed doesn't work, stubborn is all you've got. That's the story of Millers Creek, the story of a city rescue crew that laughed at an old farmer, and an old farmer who taught them that physics never changes, that leverage never fails, that the old ways sometimes work when nothing else will. Derek Hollis broke 4 cables. Eugene Pratt used chains that bent but never broke. The excavator came out of the ravine, and somewhere in Iowa, those same chains are still working, still pulling, still teaching, still proving that some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were made.